This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive into the goings-on at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. I'm Luke Menzel, recording from COP30 in Belém, Brazil, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts and one special guest, Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here in Belém with all of you all. I don't have anything to extort you all over because you're listening to this pod, so that feels good.
There's more than enough extortion going on around us already.
There really has. I'm sure we'll get into it.
Frankie, maybe in the absence of extortion activity, you could just describe this scene, paint an image of how we're set up here as we're recording on the ground in Belém.
Well, so we're in... I should say, one of the nicer, more air-conditioned spots that you've scouted out for us. But we're outside some big side event rooms. There's some couches around, some low tables. With the setup we've got, though, we're not really be able to take advantage of the comfy couches. So we're sitting on the floor around some low tables. But having a great time.
We are having a whale of a time. We are also joined by a man whose pithy shorthand terms for the procedural gambits of the COP31 presidency, sweeping the negotiating rooms, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Hello. I do seem to be recreating Inception here at the COP, so far with no criminal intent. So far. We'll get to the term that you have coined and is sweeping the rooms. But we're also very excited to be joined by a policy correspondent at leading climate policy and science website Carbon Brief, Josh Gabitus. Welcome, Josh.
Hello. I'm delighted to be here in this slightly anarchic setup. I'm looking forward to trying to remember as much as I can about what's been happening over the past week.
Yes, it has been a big week. We have sat down. We spent 10 or 15 minutes just rapidly working out what we should talk about. This will not be comprehensive. This will be a Cook's tour that is idiosyncratic, but we'll try and hit some of the key points from the first week at COP. But I wanted to start with just the vibe around the rooms and the vibe of this COP. Every COP has its own character. There was a lot of concern coming into Belém, just in terms of accommodation, the difficulties of actually getting to what is a relatively remote part of Brazil. What has been the feeling here and the experience now that we're sort of 5 days in?
Well, I would say it's a bit of a paradox because objectively, some of the arrangements and the logistics and circumstances have been somewhat suboptimal, at least at the outset, and challenging for people. It's very hot and the air conditioning has been problematic. There have been torrential downpours where there have been some breaches in the integrity of the massive tent structures shielding the pavilions and so on. In some ways, and struggles with food even, in some ways worse than some other COPs where people thought they were pretty bad. But the feeling is actually pretty good. Mm. There's a huge amount of goodwill. The people of Belém have been extremely welcoming. I was leaving my Airbnb this morning and a lovely elderly woman across the road sweeping out her front bitumen, just waved at me and blew me a kiss.
It's I think that's a sort of calling up Brazilians are known for their vibrancy, right? Mm. And I think you definitely feel that here at the COP when you're walking around Belém. And the thing that I would say, and these are sort of some of the stories I've been picking up, I didn't know this until I got here and was talking to Australian Brazilians that are supporting a lot of work here. Belém is it's sort of the Bethlehem of Brazil. Its name actually means that. And I've been told that every year or every couple of years, 3 million Brazilians and people from around the world will come here on a form of pilgrimage, and they're sort of absorbed into the city. So I'm kind of questioning why that story didn't get out a little more when there were questions around accommodation capacity and things like that.
Because it's been fine, right?
Yeah, by and large, it's been fine. Like, okay, some chaos at the airports with people missing connections and long queues and things like that. There's always a bit of a crunch
Some
around
people.
that.
Yes.
Sorry, Tennant. I know that's triggering for you. Took you an extra 24 or 36 hours to get here, right?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine now.
Yep. But I would say like the complex here, the blue zone, the green zone, it's great. Like, okay, there's issues with air conditioning, but actually, like, I think it's fine. I think it's got a better layout than last year's COP in Baku.
It's incredibly easy to get around compared to recent COPs, which are normally a complete maze. I think last year there were no maps for several days at the start of the COP, and then when they were brought in, they were upside down, so it was very hard to navigate. This is just a long tube, which is very easy to navigate, at least we're not currently in the tube, but for the most part, it's a tube. And yeah, I mean, I agree. The first couple of days, the centre was clearly still being built. There were a lot of pavilions that didn't exist, several more that had no one in them. So, yeah, clearly there were some teething problems, but I think it seems, I agree, the vibe is good.
And every day it feels like the logistics are a little better, even with some of the challenges from rowdy stakeholders that we might get to. Stuff's like it's working well now.
Well, let's get into that. There's been some protest activity around the COP, right?
Yeah, like a couple of big disruptive ones, and then as we record, a huge non-disruptive one. The march, the People's March, is happening as we record. Well, is it still happening as we record?
I think it's still happening, yeah.
It's not at the COP, it's in town, and it's notable that this is the first COP in a while where that has legally been able to happen, because Brazil is a democracy.
Crazy talk.
I think, yeah, I mean, the last time it happened was in Glasgow, and it was a really nice event, and it's great to have that back because of the... I'm speculating, perhaps because of the other protests you alluded to, there is an enormous police presence at this COP, which is something
it's a
to
little
behold.
Confronting, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's hundreds of military police with large weapons.
Yeah, semi-automatic weapons.
Semi-automatic weapons, like Ninja Turtle kind of body armor.
I won't hear you talk down these heroes in a half shell, Frankie.
It's very intimidating and impressive kind of display, and I think it stands in stark contrast to some of the more disruptive, like the people who have been protesting out here. And I think it's the one that I would just like to highlight is by local Indigenous people here, and I think the contrast in imagery of Indigenous Brazilians in traditional dress standing outside, sort of creating barricades or barriers to COP participants getting in. Like, I think it was yesterday, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah. It's hard to track time in this place. Yeah. But that shut down the front entrance and created a lot of disruption. But even in just sort of walking past and observing that protest, standing there in a lot of solemnity, if you like, and actually very striking when I was walking past, they were staring at people walking past. I found it very, very moving, and I think I'm glad they're taking their opportunity to do that. And the point that they were trying to make is there are a lot of people who don't get inside of COPs. But I also would say the presidency had highlighted to me, or I'd read, that there are 5,000 First Nations people registered at this COP, which is more than you have seen historically. So, that's good, but it obviously doesn't go nearly far enough.
It does seem that, from what I gather, as you say, a big part of the demonstrations have been about access. So Indigenous people forcing their way in at times to the negotiation to the conference centre, but also just about domestic Brazilian issues more broadly, which seems like it's a good reminder that this stuff doesn't happen in isolation. These people have, issues with the Brazilian government, and they're using this venue to take them up. And I think it is a good reminder to us all.
Let's get into the substance of it all. I want to open with the action agenda, which, the Brazilian presidency has spent a lot of time thinking about. There's quite a fulsome action agenda, and also an attempt to put a bit more structure and resourcing around it as well. Josh, I know you've been following this pretty closely. How many priorities do we have?
So, I forget all the terminology, so don't quote me on all of this, but it's 6 categories that they've broken it down into, within which there are 30 action points. I believe that's the term, but it might be something different, which kind of capture a broad range of the things that need to be done to deal with climate change. So it's a lot of things that we're already familiar with, like the tripling renewables target and transitioning away from fossil fuels, the big stuff. I guess the key thing about the action agenda is not a new idea. Previous presidencies have had this space that they use to just make big announcements that grab headlines at COPs. Going back to the UK COP, I mean, we were particularly bad for this. I would say there was a constant deluge of announcents.
Coal, cash, cars, and trees.
He's got it. It's a great strap line, and clearly it's had an impact. And it's not a new thing, but I think what appealed to me personally, and my desire for a bit of simplicity, was that the Brazilians were talking about there was a lot of build-up before the COP, but they were talking about making this more about streamlining existing proposals and pledges instead of just coming out with a load of new ones, and kind of basing it around the global stocktake, so stuff that countries have basically already agreed to do. So in that sense, it should be about, what they're talking about is making this COP more connected to real life implementation, not just talking about stuff.
The implementation COP.
The implementation COP, exactly. And so I guess the question is, there was a lot of hype ahead of the COP, and I guess the question is, what's actually happening here? And I have been trying to work that out, and I've got to say, it is a bit of a struggle, because what is noticeable as a journalist is that they are still holding press conferences and saying, we've got a new plan, the Belém Health Action Plan, things like this. And I guess my immediate question was, well, how is that any different to what previous presidencies have done?
There's an org chart now.
Indeed, yeah. There's an org chart. It does seem like there has been this big effort. There's something like 700 initiatives that they came up with. I think not just from the UN process, but also more broadly. I'm still trying to nail down exactly what their criteria were, but they contacted all these initiatives, and they have got about 400 of them involved in what they're doing. That does mean that there are about 300 that either, I don't know, don't want to participate, or don't exist anymore, or don't have anyone managing them. I can only speculate, because they won't provide me with those details of those remaining ones. But the ones that have got involved, they have been consolidated into this list of something like 140 plans or something, and these plans are going to be given over to bodies. Basically, people are going to be put in charge of them. So I think there's going to be more accountability. That's the idea. It's ensuring that if there are initiatives that aren't really doing what they're supposed to, going forward, there will be more accountability. I think that's what the Brazilians are trying to do. Whether or not that's a big takeaway, or we'll all get to the end of the COP and be like, wow, I'm so glad that happened. I don't know.
So one conversation I had earlier this week, in which this resonates for me, is like the idea of how the balance between the action agenda and negotiations have kind of evolved over time, and the reasons for that. And the observation that we can make is that, or has been made, is that because we should be, and we should be moving into this phase of actually getting stuff done in the real world, rather than sort of setting up the framework for action, that over time you would expect to see more and more focus in the action agenda as the sort of territory for new negotiations, kind of shrinks a little bit. So that's an interesting dynamic here as well.
Well, there's that sort of evolution in the process that, we should be transitioning from frameworks to implementation. But there's also the reality that it's incredibly fraught at the moment within the formal negotiations. The shift in the US's position, pulling out of Paris, and there being a strong sense that parties to the UNFCCC sort of forming into these quite solidified blocks, making it more difficult to make progress in those formal spaces. The action agenda provides a different space where you can have coalitions of the willing that take particular issues forward and in a productive way.
I mean, I would say on the US of it all, I can't see that having featured prominently here at all. As in, no one is really spending a lot of time talking about the US here, as far as I can see.
I agree.
Not directly.
Yeah. And they are not here officially at all. They're entitled to be here. They're still in the Paris Agreement until, January next year. They're still in the UNFCCC, but they have opted not to show up in an official capacity.
But the indirect kind of piece of that, I think, came up in yesterday in one of the consultations I think we'll talk about, where there was a reflection on the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And this was sort of part of the broader agenda-setting discussion, and this desire to be able to walk away from this COP with a reaffirmation of multilateralism is actually working in the Paris Agreement. Like, yes, we're not where we need to be. There is an ambition gap, but we're better off than we would have been if we hadn't done it in the first place, and a real desire to bake in that message.
Yeah, totally. I think that one of the things we were wondering about going into this COP was, would the US show up? Because they're still a member of the UNFCCC. They could still cause quite a lot of trouble if they wanted to. So, in terms of the available options for us, them just being absent is probably the best outcome available. But you also don't have the US on the field pushing ambition forward, being a constructive party, finding pathways through the negotiation process. And they carried a lot of weight when they were on the field and looking to play that role. And I think that absence is felt.
They also used to play a role just kind of keeping the process to its formal requirements, like coming in with a very well-resourced grounding of this is a kind of decision or piece of text that actually we can't make in that form given our existing procedure. Like, they were holding the process to account in a form. I have heard that actually China is playing that role in some rooms now, as guardians of procedural accuracy. That hasn't happened in the room I've been in. They've been the guardians of bad metaphors there.
So many bad metaphors.
Well, but before we leave the action agenda at all, I'm interested in your reflections on the role of these special envoys that have been created. There's lots of them.
I think there's 30, isn't there?
There's 30 special envoys.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. 30 special envoys.
So there's envoys for strategic regions, and then there's sectoral envoys as well. But I don't know. I'm actually interested. Have you come across any of them?
I came across one in a press briefing yesterday. Carlos Lopez, the COP30 envoy for Africa, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm not entirely clear about what their role is, but he was certainly there talking about issues affecting Africa. But I suppose from a kind of slightly different standpoint, he was there with the African group chair, and he was talking in much broader terms that went beyond the actual negotiations, talking about the debt burden of Africa and things like this. It was interesting to hear from him, but I don't know what he is supposed to be contributing to the process. Maybe you guys have insights.
I will just say at tvtropes.com there is a trope called conservation of ninjutsu. If one ninja shows up in a movie, they will be the most devastatingly difficult opponent you could imagine. If 30 ninjas show up, they will drop like flies.
So my reflection on this is they have not featured very prominently in kind of my observations around the grounds of COP30. But this is sort of the case at every COP. There's some kind of innovation. There's some stuff that's tried, and some of it sticks, and some of it slides down the wall.
Much like a ninja thrown aside in a devastating finishing move.
But these special envoys and high-level champions, they have a role well before the COP happens, right? And
Yep.
so maybe it is kind of being clear that actually maybe some of the focus and the bigger contribution is on coordinating, all those kind of discussions that lead into COP that shape up the agenda. And I think that from what I can see has really been that role in kind of corralling different stakeholder groups, doing a lot of engagement in the lead up to, and that's probably played quite a useful role in kind of helping shape up themes that have come up in the action agenda and how's that sort of going to go through the negotiations.
So just connecting it more with the real world again.
I mean, that can't be a bad thing, can it?
It does sound good. It's good to get away from those bad metaphors and text discussions.
The Let Me Sum Up podcast, pro the real world. All right.
Can't say better than that.
So let's get into the negotiations and also just what's
enough of the real world.
What's at stake in those hallowed rooms. We've mentioned a little bit about, the fact that we are 10 years on from Paris, and that's obviously a moment for contemplation. There's also multilateralism, which is kind of on the ballot. Can this process continue to be effective? And there are some that are very sceptical about the effectiveness of this long-standing process 30 years in. I guess that's another milestone we can reflect on. And then the 1.5 degrees of it all. We heard the UN Secretary General make some pointed comments, kind of hanging a lantern on something which has been discussed within climate circles for a good year now, post GST. But really making those comments in a very public forum and making it clear that overshoot is the world that we live in. But that obviously that should not be a moment of despair. It should be a moment of redoubling our efforts to make sure that we're pulling things back as quickly as possible. What do you all reflect on when you think about, I guess, the stakes of COP30 and what is on the minds of negotiators as they're working through all these more specific issues in various rooms around at the COP?
So, to me, they're not yet feeling able to explicitly grapple with the extent of the meaning of the gap to the same extent that the Secretary General did in those remarks. I have not heard any of the people talking about gaps in the Big Four room talk about overshoot or alternatives to overshoot in any specific way. They've said variations on we're not where we should be, and then what procedurally do we need to do about that in very high level terms, but not really getting into the unlovely choices that progress to date, which is real and substantial as all parties recognise, but is also insufficient. The choices that leaves us with, they're at least one COP away from grappling with that.
I think that's right. But I also think then, and we sort of started to touch on that as well, I think a lot of people will feel like this COP would be a failed COP if there is not a really strong kind of statement or commitment at the end to redoubling efforts towards getting on track for 1.5. So, what does that look like? And so at least because we're early on in these negotiations, some of the calls have been for a move towards a 1.5 gap resourcing plan, and it all just sort of sounds a bit esoteric. So it's we know there is a gap to 1.5. Now we need countries to come up with plans to address that. I don't know, is that going to feel like the clarion call that that it needs to be. I think it's all still kind of shaping up. And
Go
it's
over
early.
the trenches yelling, supplementary meta plan 12A. Or
Well,
death.
that's just a little bit what it feels like at the moment.
I suppose it does exemplify why there is, well, perhaps some need for a cover text, which is, they at the start, it was very much being talked about as if, I think the Brazilians were saying they didn't want to have some sort of cover text that's summed up a load of additional things beyond the main negotiations. But yeah, I mean, perhaps that's why now the feeling is we absolutely do need to do that, if only to capture those big four issues that you were talking about, or some of them, but also maybe to speak more to the moment that we're in.
Should we just unpack a little bit? Like we've said big four now at least like 3 or 4 times.
Big four.
Doesn't everyone know?
Big
Surely.
four.
Well, it's the phrase that's sweeping the cop, coined by one
Some
TV.
people. Well, one doesn't like to brag, and perhaps it was broadcast into my mind by
By aliens?
Alien transmissions. Who can say? This is a product of the avoided agenda fight at the start of the COP. There had been consultations. So as always, COPs need to start with the agreement of the agenda of what will be discussed. Some things are always there, and sometimes parties want new things to be there, or they disagree that there should be new things there. And this time there were 4 issues in particular that were really important to some parties, weren't ready to be agreed at the outset that they should go on the agenda, and the presidency neatly solved it and got agreement to the agenda on day one by saying, well, we'll have some special consultations about how and whether to handle these issues agenda-wise. But it's a meta discussion of how to discuss, or whether, not meant to be, of the substance of the issues.
It's quite funny because it's kind of been put into this sort of this parallel sort of side conversation, but it's around the grounds. It's kind of all anyone wants to talk about.
It's all there is to talk about.
Where all the action,
Yeah,
like,
right.
as in, but that's the room where the heads of delegation are spending their time.
Yeah,
so
that's-
that tells you something about the importance of it.
But that's what I mean. It's kind of like it's allowed sort of the more procedural or staid, like less controversial negotiations to track along, but the energy is still with these super controversial issues where there is significant contention, even around the terms of what we're discussing.
So should we each adopt an item of the big 4 to at least explain what a 9.1, UTM, BTR, or NDC?
I can start with 9.1 if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go for it. Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, as we all know, is the bit that speaks to developed countries providing climate finance to developing countries. It's specifically about providing the finance, which means not mobilizing private finance, but I guess basically from their public coffers, from their aid budgets, things like this. It's something that is very dear to the hearts of a lot of developing countries because, for various reasons, but partly because so many countries now are cutting their aid budgets. All the big donors have reduced their aid budgets, and the US has just withdrawn altogether. So they're very keen, the developing countries are very keen to sort of hammer this issue, but it's basically a result of last year's climate finance decision, which didn't reference this Article 9.1 in the way that they would have liked, which developing countries say means that they can basically just rely, that the developed countries can just rely on private finance and other forms of finance to achieve the 300 billion goal that was achieved last year. So they're just really keen to bring something in that just hammers this issue. We need direct money from developed countries, and that's their big thing.
And no strings attached.
No strings attached.
So
Yeah.
what do you make of the impact or not of the Baku to Belém roadmap in this context?
I believe there is a high-level event that is about to happen about it, which might provide some further clarity. But essentially, I mean, yeah, this was a kind of last-minute consolation prize at the end of the climate finance negotiations last year, where everyone agrees that developing countries need trillions of dollars to achieve their climate goals. So there is a 1.3 trillion target in the goal that was achieved last year, but it doesn't really say, it doesn't point the finger at anyone and say you have to be responsible for providing this. So it's all a bit vague and aspirational. That's the argument. So there's this Baku to Belém roadmap that was agreed as a way of sort of laying out a roadmap, whatever that is. It's a word that we've all become very used to at this COP, to scaling up finance to $1.3 trillion a year by 2035. So this roadmap was produced ahead of the COP and launched. But I mean, I think it's fair to say it hasn't really made much of a dent in the negotiations. It's not really being discussed. It's hard to see how it goes forward because it hasn't. All the countries pretty much agreed that they didn't want to negotiate this further. So it's pretty unclear, and maybe it'll become more clear as it goes along.
Yeah.
How this is going to go forward from now.
I mean, the way that the roadmap has developed over the last 12 months is it's allowed that aspirational target of 1.3 trillion to continue to be worked on, which is, I think, mollified to some degree at least some of the constituencies that were very attached to that were incredibly disappointed with the formal outcome in terms of climate finance last year. And then there's been these ongoing sort of gathering of ideas into how that could be activated in various ways, shape or forms. But my sense is it's still pretty amorphous, right?
It seems to be. I mean, as you say, and there's all sorts of stuff in there, and it's good stuff. You know, the kind of ideas that clearly are needed to get climate finance flowing and dealing with not just providing finance, but also dealing with the disenablers, to use a technical term, the sort of, you know, the things that stop developing countries being able to do climate finance projects themselves. So, you know, things like debt burdens and things like this. So clearly those things need to be dealt with. Whether or not a roadmap from the COP is the way in which that's going to happen, I can't say.
Just then, in sort of having observed a lot of focus on this from like-minded developing countries, in particular, the LMDC bloc in the Big Four.
Which is the bloc within the group of 77 developing countries whose job is to be hard asses.
Yeah.
Large emerging economies, basically.
In ornery mode.
Yeah, and India speaks for them. So even just before we came here, they spent their sort of intervention in the session just now calling for a 3-year Belém action plan on Article 9.1. And they're specifically calling for, so this is just going to the point that you've been making, Josh, around just the focus of developing countries on more accountability of developed countries on sort of direct financing, because that's what this is. That's the lightning rod around this at this COP. And one of the things I've called for specifically is an agreement on a common accounting method for developed countries to report against Article 9.1. So because these negotiating blocks of this is the stuff that they care about, right? They want more accountability, more demonstration of actual finance being deployed against the goal. That's where all the energy seems to be being spent in the negotiation so far. So it's just sort of a bit of an open question around where the broader, very necessary unlocking of private finance as a part of that ecosystem needs to be dealt with, because in the real world there are all these barriers, higher credit risk and all this sort of stuff that make the cost of capital higher than it should or needs to be in developing countries. And I think it is arguable about whether that gets solved in a negotiating room like this, but someone's got to take charge of working on that agenda in a collaborative way.
And I think the issue that they're talking about, so some kind of system for accounting for climate finance better or something, not to drag things back to the real world too much, but climate finance is kind of crazy when you start looking at the numbers. It's all sorts of things, and there's countries can basically make up their own rules for what they want to report, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But I mean, it's just it wouldn't hurt to have more accountability there. But I mean, the reason that developed countries broadly clearly don't want to talk about this is because, I mean, I'm from the UK. They've reduced the aid budget again, for the second time in a few years, and there's just no
Where's
public
it going
appetite.
to come from?
Exactly. And it's just the sad thing is that people, the public, seem to just not care that much about the reduction of the aid budgets. And I assume it's the same politically in a lot of other major donors, and so it's kind of where do we go from there, really?
And a lot of countries struggling with weak growth, what they see as extremely urgent needs for increasing spending in some areas, especially defence and defence procurement, and in some countries a turn against at least some forms of climate action. It's a tough environment. Yes, these countries have vastly greater wealth and means, but they have difficult internal political conditions and economic conditions within their own context. So trillions of dollars of no strings attached public grants, government-to-government grants, are just obviously not going to happen. But always the balance in these processes is, can the push for something that is not going to happen deliver something lesser that is still useful, that is able to happen? And do all these intensely intransigent, overstated positions wind up leading to a nub of something useful that does happen? Or do we have mutually assured destruction? That's one of the big four.
They're kind of big, aren't they? Why don't I take NDCs? So obviously, this has been the big theme of 2025. Updated NDCs for 2035, and the TLDR is there is a big ambition gap for keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and so something which is roiling the cop is how to respond to that, and sort of talking to some of the negotiators around the traps. I think that there's a broad view from some of the people we've been talking to that there is an opportunity to, I guess, acknowledge the progress that have been made, but also be very straightforward about the fact that there's much more to do, and fairly quickly move on to the opportunities that we have to close those gaps. But it sort of goes to your point, Frankie, that you made earlier. How do you, through this sort of multilateral process, come to a landing point which is resonant about the seriousness of the challenge that we're facing and the urgency of taking steps to close those gaps? It's a really vexed question.
In the Big Four consultations that we've been watching, this is the other probably big lightning rod. And I know BTRs is one of the Big Four, but it's usually mentioned in the same sentence as the NDCs. These things are most closely connected. In the negotiations, we've been watching the grouping that is really actually is given the first intervention in almost every session that I've seen, is AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island Nations. And the Marshall Islands speaks for them. They have been calling for, they want to see a key kind of commitment out of this COP to addressing the gap in NDCs and the bridge on ambition to 1.5. So this morning they've been asking for an NDC response plan on how the gap to 1.5 can be bridged, which would include calls for implementation of 2030 NDCs, but for parties to develop their own 1.5 degree response plan. So what is the contribution from every party to explicitly identify how they're going to bridge the gap on ambition? And I think, as I've said, it's just what that kind of morphs into over the next week in terms of the clarion call to action. It sort of remains to be seen, but this is clearly one of the things that would be a focus in a cover text if that gets up. I mean, should I touch on BTRs while we're here? So
Not as good as BTS.
that's right. So BTRs are biennial transparency reports, and they're part of there's been an enhanced transparency framework that was only landed within the last year, right?
I think the BTRs themselves have been meant to be done for a while, but the enhanced transparency framework is was among other things about lifting the depth and quality of them.
Yeah. And so the idea is that there's a mandatory requirement for parties to submit one of these every 2 years. There's, a lot more granular information in these on how parties are keeping faith with their commitment to Paris Agreement. So, yes, it includes progress on NDCs themselves, but it has other stuff in there like information on how they track emissions domestically in their own greenhouse gas inventories, what policies, what are the policies that these countries are actually implementing to achieve NDCs. There's a focus on adaptation in them as well, and also around the sort of support needed and provided. So finance, technology transfer, capacity building, all of that. And broadly speaking, there's been an acknowledgement so far that these have been a good kind of constructive thing to do, but probably these also need to evolve to capture then the ambition gap, and I think the emphasis on finance kind of comes through in that context too.
Yeah, I think it's worth a reason. I'm sure many people listening to this will know, but a reason that so much of this is so controversial and just goes back and forth is because the issues that you've been talking about with getting to 1.5, the response of many developing countries groupings is always just, well, we need money to do that. And getting to 1.5, we need money to do that. So you need to commit, you need to give us something on finance. So it just goes round and round we go. And that is just often the narrative at COPs.
Well, and it was part of the lead-in, wasn't it, in the synthesis report and a lot of the work that other not-for-profits do on mapping what pathways are we aligned to at the moment. And there's a really clear kind of distinction and difference in temperature outcomes between conditional and unconditional NDCs. And the conditional piece is around, well, if countries had access to all the finance they need to deliver on the ambition that they've got, then the outcome looks significantly different. So you're right, just sort of it does end up reverting back to, well, we can't meet that unless this finance happens and it's not flowing, and where's the accountability, and so on and so forth.
And in this process, there's always some parties who are very sincerely advancing one side or another of that dynamic. And there's some parties who are really quite comfortable if it takes as long as possible for mitigation to happen, and are trying to string things along, really. And so it is just constantly necessary to sort of decode a bit in these discussions, but also to look for those parties who are really they're raising problems in order to find solutions, and to move things along overall. When this process works, it is when the call for finance and the call for action are both moving in lockstep together, rather than being used as an excuse for why the other is impossible.
So the thing that I'm wondering about a little bit with this is, you've got the classic Paris ratchet of every 5 years, new NDCs, and, hopefully more ambition as countries get more comfortable with their trajectory and the achievability of more ambitious targets. But it feels to me a little bit like there's a move on to retrofit a quicker cycle of review in light of the ambition gap we're seeking, a unwillingness to say, oh, well, here we are in 2025 and there's this gap and we'll think about it again in 2030. I feel like there is an attempt to create some new architecture to deal with that gap in a more timely way, right?
There are also some attempts to do the opposite.
Yeah, but the call for that even creates tension too, because part of the dynamic going on in this presidency consultation and the thing around BTRs needing to be lodged every 2 years, actually, like, not many parties have actually done it. And the response is from developing countries, we don't have the resources to do the stuff, like, you know, we don't have the resources to do the actual stuff that will make a difference to the climate, let alone all this extra reporting burden that you want countries to. So, like, part of the call, and it's sort of wrapped up in the financing of it all, is like we need more resources to even do the stuff the UNFCCC wants us to do.
So just on this point, Super Summerupperers who subscribe to the bonus content of the Let Me Sum Up podcast may have enjoyed several bonus episodes about sector plans prepared by the Australian government as part of its deliberations around a 2035 target and a long-term emissions target. We and our guests have had some critical things to say about aspects and inadequacies of those sector plans, but their existence and their content puts Australia light years ahead of what many countries either have done or just have the ability to do. And, you know, a 60-page document that notes a bunch of existing activities and gives some sketches of the directions for relevant sectors is, like, in this context, counts as a quite substantial contribution. So buck up, climate wonks in Australia. You've never had it so good.
All right. There's one more in the big four, and that one more thing is, of course, Tennant.
Unilateral trade measures, which... two comments about, well, how many comments can I make about this one?
Does Josh know that you're a CBAM sicko? You do
He does now. He's backing away from the microphone. He's running for the exits.
That is very funny.
So UTMs, which a bingo delegate this morning said she hates because it always makes her think of UTIs. And that might be part of the intention.
And that's how some people feel about
it. Indeed, yes. Is a term of art that is highly contested. It mostly means the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, hallowed be its name, but also encompasses other tradey, climatey things that might be going on. At times, countries were complaining through this about aggressive green industrial policy, which has not come up in the rooms I've been in this time, partly because it's being abolished in the United States. It is mostly CBAM, and that term is heavily contested by the European Union, which prefers, and others on the developed country quarter, which prefer to speak about climate measures with cross-border implications. Which, you know, that sounds fine. Don't need to see your doctor for that.
I mean, it sounds like I should let you speak to this, seeing as I'm not a sicko, but
Josh Gabbatas, not a sicko.
UTM normie.
Put that on my gravestone. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge deal for, again, I think the LMDCs that we've mentioned, and they talk about them in the context of, you know, the loss of faith in multilateralism, and they say, well, this isn't the time to be bringing in these unilateral trade measures and things like this. And I think in response, the EU and others would say, well, look, this is, as you say, a climate policy. There have actually been a lot of changes to CBAM since it was first introduced. I think they've responded to some of the criticism they say, but they also say, I think, that this is just something that loads of countries are doing. It's not just, you know, they're not the only countries implementing, you know, trade measures, including developing countries. So, yeah, I think it's become highly contested, not just in this additional agenda item, but it's also being discussed across in other negotiating streams, including just transition. And what was the other one? The UAE dialogue? Anyway, yeah, there's several avenues, but because the LMDCs in particular are saying this is such a priority for them, they're saying there should also be an additional agenda item. And again, and the EU will say, well, this should be being discussed at the World Trade Organization, to which they respond, we've tried to talk about it there, and they say we should talk about it in a climate avenue. So, you can see how these things go back and forth.
And the LMDC and the Arab group, who have been the most vocal about this, they call for a discussion that's kind of got ground rules, which range from re-invoking principles from the original UNFCCC about no disguised restraints on trade, no arbitrary discrimination, but range up to the ground rule being these UTMs will be phased out, and that's what there's going to be a decision on, which is clearly unacceptable to the European Union in particular, but others. In fact, no party would concede that their domestic policy will be dictated by decisions taken here at COP.
Especially the Arab group. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And to this point about the argument that is being made, it can be difficult. I feel for the diplomats, it can be difficult to make an argument that is wholly consistent with everything that your party or your grouping does in all forums. It has been deeply weird to hear paeans to multilateral action and the perils of unilateral action from parties, including Saudi Arabia, that a month ago clubbed together to kill multilateral action, or at least put it in a coma for 1 year, on a single global approach to pricing carbon in shipping, which is that's the paradigmatic model of a sector-wide global approach to something that all parties get a voice in, although that process has a majority vote, not consensus. But where this may be heading, though, is agreement to a discussion in some form or forum that can call on people who know what they're talking about in trade or industry policy or the relevant piece of climate policy from states and from non-parties. And it connects to the action agenda as well. One of the things that the Brazilian presidency has been pushing in as an action in that space is an integrated forum or a safe space on trade where this kind of conversation can happen a little off Broadway. And the thing that's not clear to me is what kind of interface for this process is going to be able to be agreed with that conversation taking place a little outside it. I think they can get to, yes, and I believe that to know CBAM is to love CBAM. And as familiarity and understanding grows, so will siblinghood and amity, and all of these concerns will be answered. But you've got to have the conversation to discover if that's true.
Yeah, and it certainly looks like that will happen in some way. Like the proposal from LMDC is for an annual dialogue on UTMs.
And the sooner they do that, the better, because having observed this play out over a number of COPs now, the fact that there isn't a formal place to have the conversation means that it's just getting wedged into all these other places where it doesn't really fit. Understanding
is the cranberry juice that is needed to banish the spectre of UTI, UTM.
Oh, God.
Spoken like a true setter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving right along. Look, we've covered the big four. There's plenty of other stuff going on, but those are the ones that are provoking fevered conversations in the halls of COP30 in Belém. There is one other topic which anyone striding those halls that has anything approaching an Australian accent. I feel sorry for the New Zealanders wandering around and being accosted about the status of the Adelaide's bid for COP31. But certainly Australians, everyone I talk to assumes I have some kind of inside knowledge in terms of the status of the bid. I can report that is not the case. But, we have, I guess, knowledge. It's certainly a topic of hot discussion. What are the three of you picking up around the grounds?
Well, I have loved the co-location of the Australian and the Turkey pavilion.
Describe the scene for us, Frankie.
So the entry to the COP, this beautiful timber kind of facade, front of the building lets you on to kind of the start of the big long corridor, the worm tunnel that we're talking about. And you can think of it as the Champs-Elysees of the COP, right?
Sure.
Well, it is, because you've got.
Needs more macarons.
I think the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a lot of strategy that's put into the design of some of these areas, and it's a bit cheeky, strategic, whatever, that you come in and you've got some of the biggest pavilions in this initial corridor, which leads to the part of the tunnel where the big negotiating meeting rooms are. And you've got the big Brazilian pavilion, and I think the idea has been that you want the troika pavilions close to each other. So you've got the Brazilian pavilion on the right. You also had Azerbaijan not too far away, being the last host of COP. And then on the left, opposite Brazil, you've got Australia and Turkey
together at last,
sharing a border
for the first time in 108 years.
That's right. And just across the way from them is the UNFCCC pavilion. So the not so subtle hint to sort it out, guys.
Can I just interject to say the Azerbaijan pavilion is called the Hall of Legacy, which I think is a very grandiose. If they are referring to just the COP last year and that legacy, I think I found that quite endearing. We all remember that very fondly.
That's right.
Our president should be striding around the Hall of Legacy in a superhero outfit with a name like that.
It's been very entertaining because, as Aussies at COP, we spend a lot of time hanging out at the Australia Pavilion, which has doubled down on its coffee diplomacy strategy. We're still known as the place to get great coffee.
Even in Brazil.
Which is a feat. But then Turkey have got their own kind of thing going on. They're doing tea.
They're doing coffee and tea.
They're doing coffee and tea.
So there's a lot of watching who's got longer lines.
That's right.
Going up to their pavilion as some kind of metric for popularity of the respective bids.
Yeah, but they've all and then just to add another kind of layer to that competitiveness, they've got a calligrapher sitting there that's writing fancy calligraphy for people, and that's had the longest line at times that I've seen for anything. But we should talk about how some stakeholders have made use of the co-location of our pavilions.
Well, indeed they have. There was a vibrant and well-attended and impactful conglomeration of Australian and Pacific Island stakeholders outside the Australian and Turkey pavilions just a couple of mornings ago, making a really positive and broad-based case for why, A, it's time for a decision on who's hosting COP31. We've got a COP32 host.
Yeah, it was pretty insulting. Well, I think it just highlights the issue that in the last few days, Ethiopia has been confirmed as the next host.
Get ready for Addis. Well, the next.
Next.
Get ready for Addis Ababa 2027. But we don't have a decision on the COP that will be 1 year from now, where diplomatic and logistical machinery really should be grinding into action. And it is, at least at Australia's end. I don't know at Turkey's end, because we've got to be ready if the decision is made. But when will the decision be made and which way will it go? The feeling is there's a lot of support for Australia, but there's not a process per se.
Yeah. I think what we can expect, and it seems that some of this is happening, is that the pressure cooker of COP is getting some of the nations with an interest in an Australian bid and the ability to potentially place pressure onto the field in a much more active way. There has been a sense that they've been supportive, but also like letting the process run its course. The process has run a long way and it still hasn't gotten an outcome. So there's potentially a few more players on the field. The other interesting thing we hear though is that, as we've mentioned previously on the podcast, if the Western Europe and others grouping is not able to find resolution on this, it defaults to Bonn. And what we hear is the Germans really, 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 really don't want to host COP.
So there may be some kind of unprecedented, as far as I'm aware, vote in the Western Europe and others grouping. That would not necessarily carry the day. Like, I think it's pretty clear Australia would get a preponderance of that vote, but what would that vote then mean? Who knows? It's still fundamentally a consensus-driven process. And so can there be an 11:59 p.m. deal between Australia and Turkey? And what's the content of that? What's Turkey want? They maintain they don't want anything but the COP. I think in the interest of diplomacy, I will still not uncork the deeply insulting impressions of some of the personalities involved that I could do. But they haven't named a demand in public. If they have a demand in private, it might be something that Australia actually is not capable of doing.
Well, also because you've got the leaders forum, you've got the pre-COP, and you've got the COP. Remembering that we're seeking to host this conference of parties in collaboration with the Pacific, and so Australia as a government is not the only stakeholder. Like it is not possible to give away things that are important to the Pacific as part of this process, right?
And that's been part of the positive pitch for this COP. Like it's an embodiment of the spirit of multilateralism. You've got one country hosting in partnership, with a very kind of strategic grouping of countries. We're also kind of keen to point out that Oceania as a region has not hosted a COP before. So, and in also pointing out that 3 of the last 4 COPs have been in Arab, Eastern European sort of part of the world. So I'm curious to know how you're observing this to the extent you are, because we're obviously very deeply invested in it and wanting to host it. But maybe just the lead in for your comment there is I guess we landed here understanding that our Prime Minister had written to President Erdogan and he had just recently written back saying there was no change in position, and that didn't really create much of a feeling of optimism in the lead in to this. And I understand part of what had been put on the table there was the offer for Turkey to host the pre-COP, the Leaders Summit on the way in, and that hasn't been sufficient to carry the day.
It feels like that would not be a good outcome for anyone who wants to go to Turkey and then to Australia. As the token Brit on this podcast, I obviously haven't been following it as closely as you guys, but I have been speaking to people here, and it definitely does. It's a nice idea to do a joint COP with the Pacific. As you say, there hasn't been a COP in a Pacific, although Fiji did hold the presidency, but then had to host it in Bonn because it didn't have the capacity. So I suppose this is it is a bit closer. I did point out very cleverly, I thought, to one of your countrymen that Adelaide isn't actually already in the Pacific. I thought that was a great observation by me.
Classic Josh.
Yeah.
But it would have been nicer, a bit neater if you'd chosen one of the cities on the east coast. But,
Well, there's a whole other conversation we could have about that, Josh.
that's not for me to say. But anyway, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really hard to see how it's going to pan out, and I really don't have any more insights than you guys, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll see.
I think the thing we can say is that based on the current trajectory, it's not going to happen quickly. And we're likely looking at something that lands a closing plenary. Yeah. I reckon that covers it, gang. Are there any final observations you want to make before we wrap this one up?
Well, just from me, just that while the coffee diplomacy from Australia and the calligraphy diplomacy from Turkey and China has, they've both been successful in their ways. The standout winner of public diplomacy at COP30 has to be the Republic of Korea, which has been distributing to the lucky few, now including Frankie and I, after certain irrevocable undertakings were made by us in return, K-pop Demon Hunters fans,
So good.
which combine beautifully the cultural power of Korea and the dire necessity of cooling power here at the sweatiest COP I have ever attended.
So great.
Right. They are very cool. We'll make sure that the various social posts associated with this episode capture that particular cultural artifact, which is not one I ever expected to run across at a conference of parties. All right. Well, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Parachuting in and sharing your insights. It's been really fun having you on the show.
No worries.
But that's all we have time for. This podcast was edited by energy professional podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. We will be back in your feed next week, right, to share where COP30 actually lands, and by then we might have a result on the host of COP31.
One can only hope.
One can only hope. We will wait with bated breath, but until then, for Frankie Muskovich, Tennant Reid and Josh Gabatis, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. Done.